Hey guys, James saying. So today's video will be on arterial blood gas interpretation. Now there's a couple different ways of thinking about it. There's a memorization, like there's a table. If you just remember which way the arrows are pointing up or down, then you can plug that in and say whether this is, whatever, metabolic acidosis, alkalosis, respiratory acidosis, alkalosis. That's not really the way my brain works, or I don't want it to be a feat of memorization. I want to understand what's going on. So there are a few things that you have to remember. So let's take a look. So in blood gas interpretation, the pH is important. You have to know normal, 7.35 to 7.45. You just have to remember that. And the CO2 is 35 to 45. And that kind of helps because 7.35 to 7.45, 35, 45. And then you have to focus on the bicarb of 22 to 26. While the O2 is important, the base excess, the SaO2, that's important for treatment of the patient, not so much for blood gas interpretation. So remember normal so that you can identify abnormal. Okay, so in the regulation of the pH, we have one component, the buffer system. It says it works on a fraction of a second, but it takes days to reach its peak. It prevents rapid and dramatic changes in pH, and then we have the respiratory system by retaining or blowing off CO2. So CO2, this works quickly. When you have carbon dioxide, I think I've got another slide. Carbon dioxide forms with water. We have a lot of water in our body. It makes carbonic acid. So if you can remember that CO2 is an acid, and if you add more acid than you need, it makes you acidotic. So, by the way, a pH acidosis is a low pH, alkalosis is a higher pH. So most people get it that if you add a bunch of acid, you become acidotic. But you have to, in your body, there's a normal amount of acid and there's a normal amount of buffer. So if you're missing some acid that you should have at a normal value, that makes you alkalotic because now you have more buffer relative than to the acid, and vice versa. If you don't have enough buffer, which neutralizes acid, which raises your pH, makes you more alkalotic. So if you have a normal amount of buffer, that's where you should be. But if you have too much buffer, I think everybody goes, okay, well then you're going to be alkalotic. You have too much of this stuff that neutralizes pH. But if you do not have enough buffer that you should, then that makes you acidotic. So that's kind of the key point. You have a normal amount of acid, a normal amount of CO2, you have a normal amount of bicarb, a buffer, something that neutralizes acid. If you have an abnormal CO2 or an abnormal bicarb, it's either causing the problem or it is trying to fix the problem, as like trying to compensate. So that's a really key point. As you go through and interpret blood gases, if your CO2 is normal, you should have in your mind, is it causing the problem or is it trying to help fix the problem? And the bicarb, if it's abnormal, high or low, it's either, you have to identify it's either causing the problem or it's trying to fix the problem. All right, so in the respiratory compensation, how do you increase or decrease the rate and depth of your breathing, which will affect your CO2. For the bicarb, your kidneys increase, decrease the amount of hydrogen ion, decrease, increase the amount of bicarb that you have available for affecting your pH. So the kidneys increase bicarbonate generation or reabsorption, and they increase or decrease the secretion of hydrogen ions. But it takes days for this to reach its peak maximum effect. So when we look at some things that can mess up your results, like I'm not going to go through them all, but let's just look at some blood gases. This is to help you determine. We're going to assume that we have an accurate result on the correct patient, that it was run in the lab correctly. Acidosis causes some things. Alkalosis causes some negative things. But how to determine what the blood gas is telling you? As I said, we're going to look at the pH, the CO2, and the bicarb. So the 3 steps to doing this: 1, you're going to assess the pH. So in your 3 steps of doing this, you have to look at the pH and determine if it's normal or high or low. Low would be acidosis, high would be alkalosis. And you have to look at the CO2, determine normal, high, low, and you have to look at the bicarb, determine normal, high, or low. So an increase of the pH above 7.45 is alkalosis. A pH is less than 7.35 is acidosis. On the respiratory, this is getting into the arrows. I'm going to go through this just kind of quick. This is not the way I want to learn something, but I put up here, you can have it here if this is the way you want to do it. So some people, I do have some students, they memorize this table. And so they say, they write out this across the top, they write out this down the side, and they look at the blood gases that they have, and they plug in, is the pH high, is the pH high, is the pH low, is the CO2 high, low, and they plug in their arrows, and then they just say, oh, I have respiratory acidosis because I plugged in my arrows, and then this tells me, well, that's not the way. I mean, you can do it that way, well, that's fine, but I want to do it and understand it. I want to be able to look at it and understand it. So here's normal. You have to know normal. If you wanted to be exactly normal, 7.4, CO2 of 40, and a bicarb of 24. But there's a normal range. That's a normal blood gas. All right. So now let's practice. So we have a pH of 7.32, a CO2 of 50, and a bicarb of 24. So the first thing you say, so the pH is not normal, 7.32. So this is acidosis. So you have to be able to recognize that. Now you're going to figure out, I'm going to hold off on compensation. Let's do some practice with no compensation. It's just purely going to be respiratory acidosis, alkalosis, or it's going to be metabolic acidosis, alkalosis. So you have to say, since the pH is not normal, is it acidotic or alkalotic? Okay, it's acidosis, 7.32. Now the CO2, 35 to 45, it's 50, so the CO2 is abnormal. The bicarb, 22 to 26, the bicarb is exactly normal. So the bicarb is normal, it's not causing the problem. So will a high CO2, which binds with water, turns into carbonic acid, would a high CO2 make you acidotic? Yes, it would. This is respiratory acidosis. All right, so we have a pH of 7.58, a CO2 of 20, and a bicarb of 22. So 735, 745, is the pH abnormal? Yes. So this is alkalosis. This is a high pH, 7.58. So now we got to determine what's causing the alkalosis. Is the CO2 normal or abnormal? It's abnormal. It's low. And the bicarb, normal or abnormal? It's in the normal range. So we'll set that aside for a minute. So you already have a big hint that this is going to be respiratory alkalosis. So you have to say to yourself, will a low CO2 cause alkalosis? Yes. You're supposed to have a normal range of CO2. If you have too much, it causes acidosis. But if you don't have enough of what you're supposed to have, then the alkalosis side dominates. Respiratory alkalosis. So we have a pH of 7.21. We have acidosis. CO2 of 35 to 45, it's 40. It's not CO2. The bicarb should be 22 to 26, is 10. So this is metabolic something. It's metabolic acidosis. Then you say to yourself, not having enough bicarb to neutralize acid, will that make the acid take over? Well, yes, it would, and it will make you acidotic. So we have metabolic acidosis. pH of 7.56, that's alkalotic. CO2, 38, 35 to 45, it's not CO2. A bicarb of 44, well, 26 is the top end of normal, we're at 44. Will too much bicarb, it's neutralizing too much acid. This is metabolic alkalosis. This is the way I think. This is the way my brain works. You have to look at identifying, is it acidotic or alkalotic, and then which of your abnormal things is causing a problem. All right, so now we can have by the way, you can have both. You can have metabolic and respiratory alkalosis. You can have metabolic and respiratory acidosis. And then you get into the compensation. So the way you should think about compensation, if you have an abnormal CO2, ask yourself, is it causing the problem or trying to fix the problem? If you have an abnormal bicarb, is it causing the problem or trying to fix the problem? So we have 7.23, so we're acidotic. So we have a CO2 35 to 45, so that falls in the normal range. I can see it's starting to go low, but it's still normal. And we have a bicarb of 12, so my bicarb is low, so I don't have enough stuff to neutralize acid, so acid takes over. So I have metabolic acidosis. There's no compensation yet. It looks like the body might be starting to try, but you're still in the normal range, so there is no compensation here. And you really can't tell compensation unless you're looking at a series of blood gases. All right, so we have 739, 735, 745, which already go, well, that's normal. But the CO2, that's normal. Bicarbonate, well, that's a normal set of blood gases. So don't get confused. Sometimes on the test, they'll just give you normal. Okay, it's normal. All right, 7.2, acidosis. Well, the CO2 is high. Well, a high CO2, will too much acid cause acidosis? Yes. So this is respiratory acidosis, and the bicarb is normal, so it's not compensating. So this is respiratory acidosis. Now we have 7.5, we're alkalotic. CO2, 35 to 45, so the CO2 is low. Will a low, not having enough acid, will that cause acidosis? Yeah, so we have respiratory alkalosis, and then the bicarb's not doing anything as far as compensating. 22 to 26, that's normal. So we have alkalosis, we have respiratory alkalosis. All right, 7.08, shit, this is bad. This is really acidotic. Somewhere along the line become incompatible with life, around 6.8 or 6.7. People want to send you a patient to the cath lab. Well, their pH is 6.7. It's like, the cath lab's not going to fix anything. All right, but I digress. 7.08 is CO2. So we're acidotic. We have a CO2 of 60. Well, that will certainly cause acidosis. Now we have a bicarb of 15. So will a high CO2 cause acidosis? Yes. You have too much acid. A bicarb of 15, the stuff that neutralizes acid's low. If the stuff that neutralizes acid low, will that cause a problem or it'll contribute to the problem? So this is respiratory and metabolic acidosis. pH is 7.6. This is alkalosis. If the CO2 is low, which it is, so this is respiratory alkalosis, and the bicarb is still in the normal range. Respiratory alkalosis, there's no compensation. 7.56, alkalosis, a high CO2. Will a high CO2 cause alkalosis? No, a high CO2 causes acidosis. It's not causing the problem. Big clue. It's not causing the problem, it must be trying to help. We have a bicarb of 40. Well, a really high bicarb, it's neutralizing too much acid to make you alkalotic. It sure will. So we have metabolic alkalosis, but this is a compensation. The body's trying to compensate. I bet your next blood gases, because this happens really fast, your pH is going to come down. But this is metabolic alkalosis with respiratory compensation. Hopefully that's clear. This high CO2 will not make your pH go up. A high CO2 makes your pH come down. This is what I mean about understanding. That's what makes compensation easy to get. All right, 7.5 are alkalotic. So we already know, boom, we're going to put the alkalotic stamp on it. Well, a high CO2, well, same thing again. A high CO2 is not going to cause, why do I have two examples of the same thing in a row? So this is, so a high bicarb of 44, this is metabolic alkalosis with respiratory compensation. I don't know why I put two in a row. I don't usually do that. Maybe so people don't think, it's got to be something we didn't just have. So you may have a test and it's like two of your answers in a row are going to be the same thing. pH 7.08, acidotic, a high CO2, yes, that causes, we have respiratory acidosis And will a low bicarb, the stuff that neutralizes acid, I don't have enough of it? Yeah, that contributes to the problem too. It's not fixing anything. We have metabolic and respiratory acidosis, or you can call it respiratory and metabolic acidosis. 7.33, we're just barely acidotic. CO2, 35 to 45, CO2 is low. Well, a low CO2 won't cause acidosis. A low CO2 will make it go the other way. This must be our compensatory mechanism. So we have a bicarb of 20. The stuff that neutralizes acid's too low. Will that cause acidosis? Yeah, it will. So we have metabolic acidosis with respiratory compensation. A pH of 7.49, alkalotic. Will a high CO2 cause alkalosis? No, a high CO2 causes acidosis. So the CO2 is compensating, respiratory compensation. It's got to be metabolic alkalosis. Well, we have too much bicarb, too much stuff neutralizing acid. Does that make the pH go up? It sure does. Metabolic alkalosis with respiratory compensation. Why is it respiratory compensation? Because the CO2 is going up. A high CO2 will not make your pH go up. It will make your pH go down. So you expect on your next blood gases that your pH is going to be dropping. All right, so I hope this helps in your understanding. If you just think about CO2 as something a high CO2 causes acidosis, a low CO2 can cause alkalosis, and a bicarb, you need a normal amount, but a high bicarb causes alkalosis, a low bicarb causes acidosis. So I hope this helps in your understanding and your interpretation of ABGs. If you liked the video, hit the thumbs up. It would help my channel. And if you found the information helpful or useful, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you do, remember to turn on notifications so that you don't miss when the next video comes out. All right, guys. Thanks so much. See you in the next video.